Now, this is one of the most enduring illustrations in the CAADP architecture. It's been used time and time again. I'm sure we're all tired of it now, this particular CAADP country process picture. It was in the original CAADP country guidelines, and it's in the new country guidelines, it's in the post-compact guidelines, so it's basically everywhere. And actually, one of the prime principles of the CAADP process when it started, just after the Maputo Declaration of 2003, and after Rwanda's first, from 2005, you can say they started introducing this at country level. One of the prime principles was increased stakeholder participation, and they always talked of inclusive processes. And they had, in this particular picture, which sort of gives you the CAADP cycle, it started with a country team, then of course there was the expert pools, then there is the business meeting somewhere here, then there's there's public-private partnerships. You can't read it, but all around this cycle there were everywhere points and events where stakeholder participation was foreseen. Now, the one thing that really I feel has managed to establish itself is this CAADP country team. A lot of the other participation that was planned for initially has sort of sometimes fizzled out or has taken different forms. But in all countries that have signed a compact, this compact was prepared by a CAADP country team, and it was signed by a cross-section of stakeholders, and in many cases the CAADP country team, it was always multi-stakeholder because one of the requirements of the CAADP process was to actually include non-state actors. And in many cases, this particular CAADP country team has later on become part of the coordination mechanism of the agriculture program that was developed under the process. So this particular part of the CAADP process, I would say, has found its way into implementation. But, and Colin and myself are completely on the same wavelength here, the focus of participation in the CAADP process has been very much like this. It's exactly what you said. There's been, and it's not just the CAADP process, it's every time. It was in the swap era, we saw that. It's always when we start talking about designing programs, there's a lot of emphasis on getting people on board and involved and engaged and participating at the start, at the formulation phase. The whole thing fizzles out as the process moves forward, and particularly critical, of course, is implementation, because whereas one could still argue that at the level of the policy and the planning and the budgeting, there is a quite large role for the public sector to play, because after all, these are public sector mandates, and yet this is where non-state actor participation is sought. However, when we come to implementation stage, implementation of any given agricultural program is not by the government. The government in implementation plays a minor part. It's actually farmers that are doing the implementation. It's the private sector that is doing the work. You know, an agricultural program, and this is the big difference between health and education sectors, where under health you can build hospitals and staff them, and under education you can build schools and teach kids, but under agriculture you just create the frameworks. Implementation is private sector driven. And that is where the private sector simply does its thing, but not as part of a cycle that is about learning from implementation, changing plans based on where you see the thing is still not working. This is where the private sector does its thing. Government and private sector don't sit together. Government continues on its plan, and this is why learning, the opportunity of learning, is so often missed. So we also recently did a study on CAADP and country systems, where we visited a total of 8 countries by now, and looking at how CAADP is embedded in country systems. And one of the things we also looked at is coordination under CAADP and what happened. Now, as I said, we asked people in the countries we visited, what is the value added of the CAADP process in your country? And in fact, a lot of the people replied that the value added has been inclusive processes. Because a lot of government people said, we previously never took the private sector serious. We didn't invite them to our policy table. We didn't actually talk to them, you know, mistrust. But since CAADP, they are now table. So at the formulation stage, the round actors country contacts had them signing. Stock-taking consultations, also private sector actors, farm organizations, civil society was asked, and for many, this is therefore one of the greatest CAADP achievements, that it has brought inclusive processes to the country. Now, when the CAADP roundtable team, that's the CAADP country team in many cases, when that becomes the part of the coordination mechanism of, for example, a national agriculture investment plan, which is a program under CAADP, then of course you can say there is an element of inclusive coordination, because after all, coordination now, in most of these countries that have a NAIP, a National Agriculture Investment Plan, the coordination mechanisms that you see, agriculture sector working groups, technical working groups, agriculture units, they do have non-state actors on board. However, surprisingly, the private sector non-state actors are still not seen as a real partner in implementation. You see it everywhere, and as far as my visit when I went to Rwanda, it would be the only thing in Rwanda where I think there's still scope for improvement. I mean, other than that, it's near perfect, the way that country worked. But in Rwanda, for example, there's a very high commitment to provide a suitable extension to farmers, and the government has set up a very, very dense network of extension. Then the Rwanda Agriculture Board is busy even setting up a voluntary or a community-based network of extension that comes from the bottom up. So they have one from the top down, one from the bottom up. It is incredibly complicated, incredibly dense, there's a high political drive behind it. But when we talk to the farm organization, Imbaraga, which is the national farm organization of Rwanda, they too, of course, have their network, which was not a network. I mean, they claimed they were not asked to be partners in extension. Maybe they were, but I'm reporting it to you as I heard it. And I can imagine, sometimes it's difficult to see the private sector as a real partner in implementation. And when we ask people about their role in these coordination committees, the private sector, non-state actors, they report to us and say it's more about the government telling us what they're doing. So it's like the government reports. What have they done in the last quarter? What are they planning to do in the next? And then you can give you an input, right, into what the government is doing. When it comes to monitoring accountability, I don't know if it's a result of the CAADP process, but parliamentary committees on agriculture, I would say, are now a fixed feature in a lot of these processes. And I guess in many countries they were even before CAADP, but it is a requirement in the budget cycle often that the agricultural budget, before it is endorsed, it is called a vote, no? The agricultural vote. And in many countries the vote is presented to the Parliamentary Committee on Agriculture prior to the budget session. So they have an opportunity now to look at the budget, and they get a report. For example, in Malawi, this is definitely the case. The Parliamentary Committee of Malawi, they get a report by the Minister of Agriculture prior to the budget session about what the ministry did in the last year, what they plan to do in the next, and the budget that they have for doing it. And the Parliamentary Committee is given an opportunity to comment, and it is only after the Parliamentary Committee on Agriculture has endorsed their plan, their budget, that the budget now is carried into the annual budget session. The time between these two events is very short, admittedly, sometimes only days, but it is a step in the process. Now, that's a good thing, but if I give you the example of Malawi, because we talked to the head of the parliamentary committee there, he said, when the government reports to us, now I come to the point of accountability, when the government reports to us, they tell us of all that they did, but they show us only the budget that was their own domestic funds for doing these things, if you follow me. In Malawi, most of what happens and most of the investment expenditure is by donors. but it is not reflected in the budget. But of course, the government uses that money to do activities. In fact, ministries in Malawi, Ministry of Lands, Ministry of Trade, when we saw them, they said they hadn't received a single government Malawi shilling in this financial year at all. All of the activities they do, land surveying, agriculture export program, is all donor funded. But that money is not reflected in the budget. So the parliamentary committee never sees it. They don't know that it exists to all intents and purposes. It is there on the aid platform, yes, on the internet. You can pull the information together, but when push comes to shove, the parliamentary committee gets to see a budget that is, I would say, less than 50% of the money that was spent, and is told of the activities that were spent on the full resource envelope. So they have it's a biased way of being accountable. And then somebody mentioned the issue of capacities. I think it was you. The parliamentary committee, these are MPs. These MPs, there's a high turnover of MPs. They change often, and they don't really understand even a budget speech. So it's difficult for them to actually play that role of accountability. Now, part of that CAADP process, but also part of any agricultural programming process, I think even before CAADP, was this issue of joint sector reviews. Some countries like Rwanda do 2 joint sector reviews per year. Most do them annually. But if non-state actors are part of these coordination mechanisms, then by definition, they are also part of the joint sector reviews, because they are part of that monitoring process, which is in itself a good thing. However, not so very good is that because so much of the investment that is part of these national agriculture investment plans comes from donors, much of the focus of these joint sector reviews is actually about accountability to donors, as opposed to a joint sector review being a mechanism that is a public document that can be looked at by civil society, that can be reported on in the press, and that can actually act as a mechanism for being accountable to your domestic actors, to your farmers, to your private sector. In fact, much of the time, these joint sector reviews are actually about accountability that is pulled upward and outward of the country, and that makes it a bit of a missed opportunity again. Now, the question was, how then do we make this better, this system? How then do we ensure that implementation is serving the needs of those who are actually doing the implementation, that the policy and the plan is actually providing that framework? And I think this is where the CAADP process intended to build a bridge. I think if we look back, that was what the CAADP process intended to add to this picture. We had agricultural swaps. We had them for a decade or longer before CAADP came in. But agricultural swaps, sector-wide approaches, were very much public programs. They were all about public expenditure in agriculture, be it from government or from donors. Now, the National Agriculture Investment Plan was about public expenditure, yes, but about public expenditure that was going to leverage in private investment. That was the whole point of that public expenditure. So the NAIP actually meant to go where the swap never went, i.e. to create that bridge from the private sector needs to the public expenditure, to the kind of public services that would create that environment for the private sector to grow. So these private sector needs, and you don't have to read them, but I actually just took them from Enabling the Business in Agriculture, which is the World Bank's Doing Business for Agriculture. It's also called Enabling the Business in Agriculture, not Doing Business in Agriculture. So these are actually things one could actually monitor in countries. I mean, the World Bank is monitoring them now, I think, in 8 countries, and will continue to do that in more. But these private sector needs, the CAADP process, by being inclusive, could have translated that into the kind of the government role that is then needed to meet these needs. I think that was the whole point of the CAADP process. Now the NAIP, as the main vehicle for implementation of the CAADP process, the NAIP could have said, okay, what should government deliverables be based on the translation of needs in the government role? What should deliverables be to create private sector-driven agricultural growth? And that is what the NAIP could have added and has not in many, many cases. Now, how do you come to these deliverables? And this is an exercise we often do, and I'll try this. I've only got one more slide, so I'll try and be finished. An exercise we often do at country level to get people thinking about that is to say, start from the outcome. You have to start from the outcome, you know? Governments are starting too much from, also because mostly when they prepare a budget, they just take the budget of last year, don't they? And then they correct for inflation, and nothing ever changes. But if you say you start from an outcome, that is an objective of your NAIP, no? An objective. So let's say, you know, I'm not going to do this in full, but let's say it's increased private investment in irrigation, right? Then you can just ask yourself, to come to increased investment, private investment in irrigation, what is needed at an output level? And then you just move from there, right? People need to have some security, some land tenure security. You know, there has to be some protection of assets so that that is not immediately taken away. Then maybe there should be some land surveying, you know, which areas are suitable for irrigation. Then maybe there should be some soil sampling, you know, et cetera, et cetera. And this is as far as I'll be going, but we've done this in quite a few countries, and it is an eye-opener, I can promise you. And if you want to do that in Kenya, go ahead, or in where you are. When you start from the outcome, and you then work to the outputs that are needed to come to this output, then the last level now is to say, okay, who are the actors that are supposed to realize this? Who are the actors? And then two things happen. One is you immediately broaden the implementation horizon beyond the government, because a lot of these actors will not be government actors. They will be private sector. So that's one. People see that in order to come to an outcome that you've set yourself in your plan, you need non-state actors and private sector. Capacity development of farm organizations, farm organizations. That's the first thing that happens. Broadening of the horizon. The second thing is, if you start from the outcome and you then look at who should work together, then it is much, in terms of inclusiveness, in terms of coordination, it's much clearer. Coordination for what? Inclusive, you know, put the private sector into our structures for what? For what? For what delivery? It's that focus on delivery that we have to bring back and always have to pull into focus when it risks to become vague. And that is why these two Maputo indicators, 10% public expenditure, that should result in 6% growth via the NAIP, that's of course the logic, but whether it's the NAIP that has caused the growth or whether it's something completely different, we don't know. And I think one of the things we should also collect is trends in private investment in agriculture, because this 10% of public expenditure has to, of course, be high quality public expenditure. Okay, final two slides. Why do NAIPs fail to bridge that gap? I think there's two reasons. The first reason is too many of these NAIPs are about business as usual. The government finds it difficult to remove itself or to sort of de-link itself from its age-old mode of thinking of supply-driven development with a focus on food security rather than growth, because of course there is a government mandate in the area of food security, but thinking about their role vis-a-vis the objective of growth is much more difficult. And then a second, much more, silly reason really, it's not so much, it's that simply some NAIPs just fail to get implemented. They stay on the shelf. So this is the end now. I think there are two key conditions that need to be met for this to change. One, of course, is that this CAADP process has to be much more firmly embedded in core country processes of planning, budgeting, reporting, and accounting. That's clear. Second, and this is much more difficult, probably even to achieve, is that we need a change of mindset regards the CAADP and the NAIP. It no longer should be about what the government, or in some cases, even only what the Ministry of Agriculture does, but it should be about what the sector needs. And many of these sector needs will only come to us if we listen to the private sector. So the NAIP should become a vehicle for agricultural growth. The NAIP is the vehicle. And in many cases, when you talk to government officials, they think of the private sector as a vehicle for NAIP implementation. So they say the private sector does not want to invest in our plan. You see, it doesn't work that way. The government, many of these plans are, government are thinking the government is going to tell the private sector what to do. That's not how the private sector works in most cases. So the NAIP is the vehicle for growth. The private sector is not a vehicle for NAIP implementation. Start from the outcome. That's what I put on the board in designing NAIPs. And then this can be summarized by the one sentence: CAADP should be a means to an end, not an end in itself. It's also what Colin said. And this, the 100% implementation of this statement, the way it is written here, I've seen in Rwanda, where the government really sees CAADP as a means to an end. They're not concerned about CAADP in any other way as a means to an end. You have to keep your eyes firmly fixed. So Mark, you asked yesterday, what is the one key ingredient of success? If you can keep every actor, if you can put that point on the horizon, the goal that you want to achieve, and make everything subject to that, that's when you have a recipe for success. Thank you.